Welcome back. On Sunday, February 26th, a speeding VIA train came off the tracks in Aldershot in West Burlington. The scene of twisted train cars, paramedics, firefighters and police, as well as the injured passengers, was chaotic, but with incredible calm beyond the tragic loss of the 3 VIA employees in the front of the first car. The first responders managed to get everyone else off the train safely. Now, a few days after the shocking incident, I sat down with several of the rescuers from the scene that day for an exclusive interview. Here is some of what they had to say about that seemingly unreal event. For most of the people whose job it is to try and save lives or help people in distress every day, this was a scene they'd never come across in their careers. A VIA passenger train had careened off the tracks, sending the cars full of people in different directions and tossing them around inside. When the cars finally stopped, the 911 calls started flooding in. This was a massive emergency, and for the crews on call that day, this was going to be a challenge.
And what I did was talk to somebody at the end of each car to find out what they had inside, and the first car was the worst, so I crawled into that car.
And when you got inside the car, what were you seeing there?
There was a gentleman in a wheelchair. The wheelchair's tied in at the corner, and he's over on this side. And I basically just crawled through and talked to everybody.
It's a challenge.
Yeah.
You know, we have to continually keep coming back to them and reassessing them and making sure nothing has changed. When we have the resources, we finally will assign a medic to specifically go and physically assess all of those patients to make sure we haven't missed an injury.
With firefighters and paramedics first on scene and working side by side in the cars, police arrive. For them, the derailment raises a set of different challenges and some serious questions.
Who's to say it couldn't happen here just as easily as anywhere else? But was there a criminal act that preceded the train? Was it caused by some outside source or organization? These are questions that we, when responding, don't have answers to.
You're getting on board this derailed train. How do you know that it's secure? How do you feel comfortable going in and putting yourself at risk like that?
Well, first of all, you have to check scene safety to make sure that it is safe around, no fluids, glass, any electrical hazards as well too. But mostly you just have to sort of weigh the options and go for it.
And while the crews went for it, they achieved something remarkable. Each of them told me how much their training kicked in, getting them past the adrenaline rush and potentially overwhelming sense of the severity of the call. And they all agree that working together, they managed to get all 45 passengers off the train and to hospital if necessary in under 90 minutes. But it wasn't easy.
It was awkward in the car because it was on a funny angle, so everybody had to chip in and pass that backboard through the train, and that was over and over.
And while focused on the task at hand, they couldn't help but be impressed with what was happening.
I remember looking up and seeing an officer standing on the arms of the chairs, of the seats, kind of crawling down and assisting inside. And just for a minute thought, isn't that extraordinary?
But it wasn't just the first responders who helped in the crisis. Several civilians on board the train did what they could to help that day, and they were recognized for their roles as unsung heroes by Burlington's mayor. A class action lawsuit in the case has been given the green light to go forward. Several passengers are looking for compensation for physical and emotional injury, property damage, and a loss of income. The investigation so far has found the train was traveling at more than 100 kilometers per hour when it came off the track. In that stretch, the limit is 24 kilometers per hour. Well, verdicts came down in 2 court cases this year after trials highlighted by denials, determined police work, and disturbing evidence. But in the end, most Canadians feel that for Tori Stafford and the murdered members of the Shafia family, justice is served. Applause outside a courthouse is something you typically see at the end of a heartwarming Hollywood movie. But while the guilty verdict handed down to Michael Rafferty had the public and Tori Stafford's dad clapping, the fact remained Tori was gone, killed by a sick couple who will likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars.
And it was all for this little girl right here, not just Tori, but for every little child in Canada that doesn't deserve what happened to her. Hey, Victoria! Woo!
When it finally builds up for a couple of years and it finally comes to trial and there is a conviction and people regard it as a good verdict, right, that justice was done, There is this collective, like, thank goodness now we get on.
It was an emotional end to the trial, which saw Michael Rafferty trying to convince the jury he was innocent. But while the evidence against him continued to mount, and while meticulous details laid out police, and even a field trip for the jury to the rock pile on a remote property in Arthur Township, where Tory's remains were found buried in a bag, it's likely the testimony of his then-girlfriend, who'd already been convicted in Tory's murder, sealed Rafferty's fate.
The verdict means that the jury has found that Michael Rafferty did kidnap, sexually assault, and murder Victoria Stafford.
Rafferty is appealing the verdict, but the violent and tragic end to Tory's life will be something many of us will never forget.
The reason you remember it, and we all remember it, is because we combine that scene with the evidence that we hear, and we think of what happened to that little girl, and it's horrifying.
Canadians were also horrified when allegations surfaced that the 4 female members of the Shafia family found dead in a car in the Kingston Lock were murdered. The accused were Mohammed Shafia, his wife Tuba Mohammed Yahya, and their son Hamed Shafia, the father, mother, and brother of the victims, Geeti, Sahar, Zainab Shafia, and Roner Amir Mohammed, who ranged in age from 13 to 52. Yahya was Mohammed Shafia's first wife. The evidence focused on wiretaps of conversations between the accused, as well as revealing their Google searches, which included lake murders and best place to leave bodies. The 10-week case was dubbed the honor-killing trial.
It really hit at a lot of issues about, how do we let people get into our society and make sure that they are adapting, and what sort of cues do we look for when things are not working? And there certainly were indications that various officials hadn't noticed things or hadn't acted on them.
But when the verdict was read, the judge called the family's notion of honor sick. And while the Crown Attorney was pleased about the message the verdict sent, he also highlighted the tragic circumstances surrounding the murders.
It's a very sad day because this jury found that 4 strong, vivacious, and freedom-loving women were murdered by their own family.
Well, we've arrived at the #1 story in our look back at 2012 now, and from spending scandals to strikes to a bombshell resignation and complete shutdown of the legislature, the last 12 months of the minority Liberal government at Queen's Park have had it all. To say the atmosphere inside Queen's Park was tense this year would be an understatement.
The Premier's office did not want to be called before that committee to testify as to their involvement in not releasing the documents.
From a scandal at the Orange Air ambulance, which had MPPs investigating what the health minister knew and when about its spending, to questions over the timing and costs of a pair of cancelled power plants and the sudden discovery of thousands of pages of missing documents related to it, all under the code name Project Vapor.
And when you see code terms like Project Vapor, I mean, it sounds like it's out of a Bond movie, for goodness sakes.
And the Liberal government was dealing with controversies it had never seen in 9 years in power.
This year is at the bottom for Dalton McGuinty and the Liberals. Everything that he's worked 9 years to build up has essentially fallen apart.
Well, this year was clearly his worst. I mean, clearly they function much better as a majority government than they did as a minority.
Battles with their opponents in government are expected, but when the Education Premier's allies in the teachers' union started to turn on McGuinty and his government,
we will not be bullied, Mr. Premier! Bill 115 tramples my constitutional rights.
It became clear how much trouble he was in. Longtime Queen's Park observers had never seen the Premier like this, and when his party couldn't win a crucial by-election in Kitchener-Waterloo, McGuinty was wounded.
And then things just started to happen. We had the Orange Air ambulance scandal sort of come up, and we found out the police were looking into this, and a committee started looking into it, and all of a sudden it started sticking to Dalton McGuinty. And then we started hearing about the details of the gas plant cancellations. And again, because it was a minority government, the opposition parties actually had control over the committees once they finally got them up and running. It took a long time, but they finally had them up and running. So now we have the opposition-controlled committees looking into Orange Air ambulance, into the gas plant scandal. And these things are really sticking all of a sudden to the former Teflon Premier.
And with the opposition smelling blood, the Premier shocked everyone and resigned in a televised address to his caucus.
It's time for the next Liberal Premier. It's time for the next set of Liberal ideas to guide our province forward.
At the same time, the Premier pulled the plug on Parliament and prorogued the legislature.
The prorogation, in my opinion, there was only one reason for Dalton McGuinty to prorogue the legislature, and that was to stop the committees. And that leaves some really big questions unanswered.
And while those questions remain unanswered, teacher opposition to Bill 115 continues, and the first teacher strikes of Dalton McGuinty's time in office started in mid-December. Now, as of the taping of this show, the teacher strikes and job actions continue. A leadership race to replace Dalton McGuinty is now underway, and his successor will be chosen in January. Well, that does bring us to the end of this look back at this year's biggest stories. Of course, from those stories, we know there will be some big news next year, including a possible trial of Luca Magnotta, a possible new mayor of Toronto. The federal Liberal Party will also be choosing a new leader, and there will be a royal baby born at some point next summer. Those are just some of the stories we know about. Who knows what else 2013 will bring, but we know we'll be covering it for you. Thanks for watching. Have a great year and a good night.
Disconnect the oxygen hose.
I'm going over.
Oppan Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style.